Good afternoon. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another iteration of the online virtual version of our Art in Focus program, which, if you haven't watched one of these videos or tuned into the live stream previously, we always do it live and in person in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries at noon, and then we do it again on the streaming platform through Fairfield University at 1 p.m. So if you are ever local to Fairfield and you know we have an art and focus going on, you can come and enjoy it directly in the galleries. The object of focus for this month is Stanton Macdonald-Wright's lovely titled color woodblock print with the quote, bright red sun, cruelly hot, but the wind is of autumn, Bashō, from the portfolio Haiga. So we're looking at a color woodblock print from the 1960s. I did include I don't usually wind up including the size when I put the captions on an art and focus object. I mean, in ideal terms, I usually try to have it in the room with me if it's small enough. And imagine my surprise in pulling Macdonald-Wright's print out of storage and being reminded that, oh, right, it's bigger than I thought it was. In my mind, I had it sized about half the scale that it is. And I thought, well, I'll bring it in and I'll have it sort of hold it up for the camera. A little bit too large and unwieldy. Although those of you who follow the Quick Center social media might have seen the museum's executive director, Carrie Weber, advertising it on a little Instagram clip a couple of weeks ago. This is a work designed by Stanton Macdonald-Wright and printed by Clifton Karhu. And it was a generous gift from the artist and his wife's estate, and just a couple of years ago. So although we don't have the physical object to share between us, I hope you are enjoying, as I have been the last hour and a half, of feasting your eyes on this wonderfully colorful object. One of the reasons why I chose this, we were joking, if you are in the Connecticut area, you know that today is actually unseasonably warm. I think it's hitting a high of 55 right about now. And it was very rainy and wet yesterday. But flashback to last semester when I was choosing the objects for Art in Focus for spring 2025. And I thought, March, let me pick something that really warms us. Because of course it's still going to be like frigid and cold. Well, I guessed wrong, but it is a very gray and foggy day here in Connecticut. So it was a pleasure to sit with a small group, and we had this object lying flat on a table because it was part of a portfolio that we received only recently. It has been neither matted nor framed. So each one is between layers of tissue paper. So we just had it on a small table to look at. And I had the position of sitting, I was facing the reverse side of it. So I was sitting, imagine me sitting behind the top of your screen, which actually led to some interesting ways of seeing. I wasn't looking at it from the desired perspective, standing directly in front of it. So that was sort of a fun interchange. We could rotate the table gently so people could get a slightly different view of what it is that we were looking at. And I know there's a lot of text in the caption for this object, so I omitted the life dates of the individuals involved, and I wrote them down separately because then we would be sort of very much overwhelmed. But this is absolutely a product of a collaborative relationship between Stanton Macdonald-Wright and the printer Clifton Karhu, both of them Americans. And what I find interesting by their life dates is that Macdonald-Wright was moving toward the end of his career in life. Clifton Karhu is really at the beginning of what would be a long and productive career in Japan of making traditional ukiyo-e Japanese woodblock prints, which is not exactly what he's doing here. But to give you a sense of when these gentlemen are from, Stanton Macdonald-Wright was born in 1890 and died in 1973. So about 10 years after, less than 10 years, excuse me, after these prints were made. And Karhu was born in 1927 and died only in 2007. So relatively recently. Of course, the early 2000s seem like last decade to me, even though it was much further away. So we have these two guys intersecting, and they're producing a portfolio of works of 20 color woodblock prints that are called Haiga. And let's take a closer look at this particular print, just so you can get a wonderful sense of the many varieties of deeply saturated color that have been used to produce this. And when we were in the gallery together, I was able to turn the print around and show the assembled group the reverse side of the sheet, so you could see how all of the colors are really coming through to the other side because of the intensity of the printing inks that were used. And someone immediately commented when we were together in the gallery that there's such a strong sense of movement, that these lines that are overlapping and whipping like a vortex over the surface of the entire print really keeps your eye moving and picks up something that we see in the title. So this quotation, bright red sun, cruelly hot, but the wind is of autumn, Bashō. And that person too has life dates because we actually have three men interacting here. We have Stanton Macdonald-Wright, the American designer. We have Clifton Karhu, the American printmaker. And then we have a 17th century Japanese poet, Bashō. So the entire portfolio, Haiga, is a collection of visual responses by Stanton Macdonald-Wright to haiku by iconic Japanese poets of the past. And drawing on his sort of visual response to them, drawing sometimes, in instances like this, on a sort of pictorial language drawn from traditional Japanese woodblock prints, often called ukiyo-e, the floating world, interspersed with his own very modernist ideas about how color and form should interact. So it's this incredible synthesis. You have a 17th century Japanese poet, you have 19th century visual aesthetics, and you have two 20th century Americans who are making this sort of bricolage of influences out of this print. And you might see at the lower left, we see that it is signed sort of in shorthand by the artist and signed in Kyoto. So telling us this was produced in Japan. Macdonald-Wright traveled there in 1952, which was apparently his first time encountering traditional Japanese prints. And he was just absolutely floored by them. And in 1952, one of the things you will learn about Stanton Macdonald-Wright, if you look him up, is that he is associated with the creation of an artistic style called synchromism. And that's synchromism with an M. You might have heard synchronism, but synchromism. He and another painter developed this artistic style all the way back in 1910 when they were trying to explore whether music theory or the ideas behind music theory could be applied to color in the same way. So Macdonald-Wright said, if you have symphony, meaning with sound, why not synchrony with color? And they're playing around with that right on the cusp of when abstract art is going to become a new concept that is floating around in the air. Very interesting to look into if you find that intriguing. But when we jump forward to the 1960s, when the Haiga portfolio was produced, Stanton Macdonald-Wright has been thinking about the expressive possibilities of color for a very long time. His exposure to Japanese art is of a little bit more recent. And then he interacts with Clifton Karhu, who's an American who winds up moving to Japan in the 1950s and eventually becoming a traditional ukiyo-e printmaker himself. In the 1970s, Karhu would be the first non-Japanese person to be made a member of the Japan Print Society, or Print Association, excuse me. So this is the association of makers of traditional Japanese ukiyo-e prints. He was inducted as the first foreign member. So he is fascinated with this traditional past as well. And it's the two of them coming together from these two different perspectives that produces this one of 20 in this overall portfolio. So at this juncture, I'm going to invite our producer to drop into the chat a link to our collections database where you'll see we have 12 of the prints in the portfolio on the collections database, and you can get a little bit of a sense there of the wide variety of ways that Macdonald-Wright is responding to these different Japanese haiku. They do not all look like this. Someone asked me that in the gallery. I was like, well, do they all look the same? It's like, no. I mean, some of them are extremely abstract. They're not always as vividly colored as this one. The reason, as I mentioned, that I chose this of the portfolio, I was like, bright red sun, cruelly hot. In March, this is going to be right up our alley, even though it was probably more like autumn when I was selecting that. So among the observations that we were sharing in the gallery, trying to make a little bit of pictorial sense of what it is we're seeing. So we know if you're familiar with Japanese woodblock prints, this might seem a little visually familiar to you in the sense of a landscape setting. We see some trees at the upper left. You might see the brown outcroppings of rock. We spent a little bit of time discussing, maybe say debating, whether the orange zone that we can see with these long straight lines, whether that should be read as a field, or someone else suggested, could that be water that is picking up the rays of the setting sun? Toward the left, a little bit closer to the foreground, we can see the thatched roof of a structure, which seems to be open to the air. And on that left edge, I'll go back here to our close-up view. We see a few people. There might be someone who's serving a drink on a tray. A few people are seated at these low tables. And we also discussed what the objects we can see in that area at the left are. With the idea of East Asian culture in mind, one of our guests said, could this be a shrine of some sort that we're looking at? We settled more toward maybe this could be a shop. You might see the characteristic fan shape of a few spread open fans. There's what looks to be a folded umbrella that is coming down vertically and with a green outline at the upper left. And we agreed that it wasn't quite clear what the distinction is between outdoors and indoors, where the dwelling or this shop is versus what might be an agricultural or another natural zone, and that there was seemingly not an effort to make things transparent to us because the whole composition being enlivened but also slightly concealed by these interweaving bands of what is perhaps wind, what is perhaps light. We had a little bit of discussion over what these intersecting lines could actually imply. And this is a quote by Macdonald-Wright himself, talking about what it is he was trying to do. And I included it because I was surprised to see him say that he attempted to pictorialize haiku psychologically. Not pictorially, he said psychologically, and thus complete the verses by making the illustrations as modern as the verses will always remain. So I'll go back to the actual verse of the haiku itself, coming to us from the 17th century. And I realize I don't think I explained Haiga, the name that Macdonald-Wright gives to the whole portfolio, refers to a traditional practice of writers of haiku creating a visualization of what they were writing their poem about and trying to use that same very characteristic, you have economy of language in a haiku where we have 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5, usually a natural metaphor, and usually containing something that seems very profound. And there was this desire to then, could you also produce a visual to accompany it that is not using many brushstrokes, but is communicating powerfully in some way? So clearly Macdonald-Wright had heard about this and he thought he wanted to engage. So he's drawing on these iconic haiku and then providing his own haiga, his own response to them, which he calls a psychological completing of the verse poem. So talk about transitioning over time from the 17th century onward. And I will say I can't rotate it because of the way it is on screen. From where I was positioned in the gallery, sitting sort of behind the print, it really brought home the sort of blobby, almost seemed like an egg yolk to me. The sun, this orange and then lighter orange and a little bit of red sort of tacked onto the side. It made such an interesting shape from where I was sitting. And we talked a little bit about what the haiku itself could mean. I am not going to attribute this to myself because of an observation that one of our guests made. And he said that, he's like, I don't think it's about what it's saying at all. I think the sun is something else. It's something that is maybe strong, maybe painful. And the autumn wind is taking your cares away, is soothing you in a way. So he saw the natural metaphor. We're in summer and we're looking forward to autumn. And he said, no, I see that as standing in for something much greater, which perfectly makes sense with what haiku are intended to do, use very short syllables or short arrangements of syllables to do something, open our eyes to something much larger. And I joked that originally when I looked at this haiku, I thought, oh, well, that's not 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5. And then I thought, oh, well, of course, it is no longer written in its original Japanese. It's been translated for our benefit into English. And I am sure that it is probably nigh impossible to keep the haiku syllable structure when translating from one language to the next while still keeping the overall meaning. If you have any observations, by the way, or any comments on what it is that we are looking at or on any of the other members of this portfolio that you've seen, and I should mention, if you're watching this on YouTube and therefore have not gotten the link that our producer has dropped into the live stream chat here, you can go to fairfield.edu/museum, click on collections, and then once you are in the collections database, the easiest thing to do is to search Haiga, Haiga, and that will bring you to the full portfolio. Or should I say, the members of the portfolio that we have at Fairfield University. And I will comment something that had already been raised. When you do that, you won't be able to blow any of the individual thumbnails up to the size you're seeing right now on the screen. And that's for the simple reason that all of these remain under copyright to the artist's estate. So we are not able to make any larger resolution sizes larger for anyone to potentially download. But they are really beautiful and stunning. And when I mentioned before the idea that you have Macdonald-Wright kind of at the tail end of his career, Karhu is going to go on to a whole different vein of kind of becoming a pillar of Japanese traditionalism, but he's an American, a foreigner who has taken up living in Japan and adopted Japanese customs. That's later for Karhu. Here you have Stanton Macdonald-Wright, who has been thinking his entire career about the expressive possibilities of color arranged as if the way you would arrange notes in a symphony. He's got a lot of ideas to put these two things together into a color woodblock. And I've brought us back to this close-up of the upper portion of the print. And if you're familiar with how Japanese woodblock prints are made, generally, you know that it's a relief printmaking process. So everywhere we see ink having been carried onto the paper, that would have needed to have been a raised area of a piece of wood with everything else around it cut away. And typically or traditionally, when making the color woodblock prints, every color area would have a separate block where all of the areas carrying that color would have been carved away. So I'll go back to our main image. For example, if we look at that brilliant orange that's at the center of the sun, if that's the same orange that we see in the fields at the right and at the very bottom margin in the center, and maybe a touch underneath the fan over at the extreme left, it's also the highlight on the edge of the trees. Imagine one woodblock where only those areas are raised, everything else having been removed, and then the paper laid down directly over that, rubbed with a paddle just to pick up those areas of orange, and then reapplied to block after block, each with a different area, different color area raised in relief. And you have to line them all up perfectly. That's the trick of color woodblock printing. You have to use these little registration marks to make sure everyone is laid down in exactly the same manner, which I think becomes really obvious too with the ways all these little lines, these sort of striping areas, stop having color. They switch from white to color. They have colors interacting next to each other. If there wasn't a perfect alignment of the paper on the blocks, the whole thing would become a mess. But it's designed so carefully by Macdonald-Wright to carry all of these different colors with each other and in these great swooping lines, which just do such an extraordinary, they have such an extraordinary amount of work, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Both work in producing this object, in the design for Macdonald-Wright, in the actual carving and printing by Clifton Karhu, and then to put it together again with the inspiration, bright red sun, cruelly hot, but the wind is of autumn. It just does, I think it does complete it psychologically as the artist was striving to do. So we talked in the gallery, we might, there was so much interest in what Macdonald-Wright was doing that said maybe in a future Art in Focus, we'll pull some other objects from the portfolio out and bring them out. I should mention, by the way, I was surprised when I saw these, when I pulled them out of storage, their scale is larger than traditional Japanese woodblock prints. And I found that interesting, that here we have, an American artist who wants to respond to this traditional method, but he didn't choose the standard sort of 10 by 15 size of an Oban format Japanese woodblock print, for example. I don't have any more reasons. I don't know why that would be, but I just found it interesting. So he's very free to bring his own interpretation, to change certain aspects of the traditional format. And I should mention, too, that last thing that he has to say, by making the illustrations as modern as the verses will always remain. I think from an artist writing in the full flush of his career in the 1960s, he's trying to make it clear how deeply he respects the 17th century poet, that he regards this haiku as deeply modern, and that he's trying to offer something equally modern through his own artistic practice to match something from centuries earlier, which really does remind us of the power of art in enabling these kind of conversations to take place, not only across cultures, but in this case, very much across time. So I hope you have enjoyed our quick little Art in Focus for today on this very gray day. It's fun to look at something bright and vibrant. I hope this is in our meteorological future sooner rather than later. And I hope you'll be able to join us for our next Art in Focus event. Thanks for joining, everyone.